Good evening, good evening. So happy to be here, such a lovely audience, and can't wait to take you back in time to the Fort Monroe of 1901. And this picture starts to give you a good impression of why we're looking at Fort Monroe in this time period, because during this time, the whole coastline of Fort Monroe was taken up by two grand resort hotels, and you can see them in the picture here. You have the second Hygeia and the first Chamberlain right here. Big steamship wharf coming out off the coastline between them. At its height, had 20 steamships a day coming in and out of the fort, bringing all sorts of stuff. And just, if I could go back to any time in the history of Old Point Comfort, I'd go back to right then, I think, because lots happening. This is really how I began researching the hotel period, the hotels at Fort Monroe. Because when you start working at Fort Monroe, you start hearing the first Hygeia, the second Hygeia, the first Chamberlain, the second Chamberlain. It's hard to figure out which one was where, when, and which were contemporary with one another. And so hopefully you had a chance to kind of get looking at these. But along the top, you have decades, going from 1820 until the present. And you'll see that long bar is Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe, that's the whole time Fort Monroe's been there. And then you see the Sherwood Inn, the first Hygeia, the second Hygeia, the Chamberlains. And then down below, I took a look a little bit at the transportation that was available to get you to Fort Monroe. The steamship service, the C&O Railroad service, and the streetcar service. And the thing that stood out to me is noted by this little green, kind of green shaded column here, that there was a time when all these things coexisted together. So thinking about this presentation, why did we choose 1901? And that's one of the reasons, that there was a lot going on as far as the tourism industry at Fort Monroe, also referred to as Point Comfort. So just to get our bearings a little bit, here's a map of a little corner of Fort Monroe and Point Comfort. You can see the outline of the fort here, and here's the moat. And if you're familiar with Fort Monroe, this is where the Chamberlain is today, the second Chamberlain, right on the footprint of the first Chamberlain. And here's the second Hygeia. This area today is known as Continental Park, big open space where concerts and weddings and so forth. In between those two, just like you saw in the picture, here comes the Quartermaster's Wharf, also known as the Baltimore Wharf, the steamship wharf. There's a few other things you can notice here. The purple is the shoreline going along here. And this green right here, this is the railroad bridge. The railroad had its own bridge coming onto Fort Monroe. And then the lighter green line is the streetcar system. So that's starting to kind of take shape in your mind. You can see how these things are all located in proximity to one another. And it's ironic, the Casemate Museum has a great collection of maps of the fort over time, and I was looking for one that had all these things at the same time. And it's interesting that the one that had them all was a proposed sewerage map. And it's interesting because one of the things that, in looking through these many, many brochures and advertisements from all these grand hotels, is they really pump up the fact that it's such a healthy location for a lot of reasons. But one, you can see the quote up there, but there's also things like, the Hygeia boasts the most perfect system of drainage of any hotel or public building in the country. And to the munificent gifts of nature is added all the advantage of sanitation by government experts. So you have these things, these great amenities at Fort Monroe. The other reason that I really picked out this year, 1901, to look at is because in addition to the many brochures, advertisements, postcards that we have about the resort life and the resort time at Point Comfort, we also have a wonderful collection of 6 letters And all these letters are written on Hygeia Hotel stationery, and they're from a woman named Grace Lula Bickford. And they're to her family. Some are to her sister, some are to her parents. And I don't know if you can make it out on the envelope there, but it's to the Bickford family, New Hampton, New Hampshire, Belknap County. And interesting that Grace is in Hampton and writing home to New Hampton. And it's amazing what, just I typed in her name and crossed my fingers, and it turns out that I could find a record of a Grace Bickford in New Hampton at that time period. And it turns out that I'm pretty sure it's her because she has a sister named Ina, who she writes to and speaks about often in the letters. And also, her parents, her father is a minister. And it also has her birth date, which is interesting. She is born, let's see here, December 19th, 1872. So when she's at Fort Monroe, she's 28. She's actually writing in 1900. And she often complains that she's worried that she'll be an old maid forever. So you can imagine this young woman at 28. The other interesting thing about her is, I think of all of us in this room, if we were transported back to, this luxurious days of Old Point Comfort, probably not a lot of us would be staying at such a fancy hotel. It was really for the elite. So what brings this Miss Bickford there? Well, it turns out that she's actually there to work. She's selling articles, seems like imports, like fans from Japan and China from England, and she's selling them at the Chamberlain's Bazaar. We don't have much more details than that, and I haven't turned up any research about the bazaar at the Chamberlain, but that's why she's there. She talks about business being good or bad or slow, and so that's interesting. And I think the fun thing about Grace's letters, and I'll be reading several excerpts of hers, is that it gives a real voice to these ads, which of course are going to be glowing recommendations of the hotels and all their amenities. But Grace's voice gives a real balance to that, and so we'll hear from her as we go along. So why were all these people being drawn to Point Comfort? So I pulled out a few testimonials here. I know of no place more exempt from bilious diseases. It is on the threshold of the Southland, but the ocean tempers the summer heat, and the winter breezes are robbed of their severity by the Gulf Stream. There is a certain charm in being in the vicinity of an army post. At no point on the Atlantic coast are there so many points of natural and historic interest within easy access as at Old Point Comfort, with a geniality akin to that of southern France. These hotels really marketed themselves as, we're just as good as those European resorts. But, these same things, it's interesting, these things are really what the hotel promoters are sharing with the public. Come here for health, come here for the climate, come here for the military. You can experience all the interests of being around the rhythms of an army post. The history, the same things that we acknowledge about Fort Monroe's history today, Old Point Comfort's history today. John Smith was there. Edgar Allan Poe was stationed there. Jefferson Davis was imprisoned there after the Civil War. The tourists of this day were well aware of all of those things too. Fort Monroe has been a great place to visit for a long time. One other sidebar is that regarding the climate, there's some interesting brochures that actually talk about for all those travelers that are wintering in the South and heading back north, it was almost like a public service announcement that it would really behoove them to stop for a day or two in Point Comfort and let their body readjust to the climate. So as we start to think about visiting Fort Monroe and Point Comfort Resort, traveling back in that time, we're kind of going to look at three aspects. How would you get there? Where would you stay? And what would you do while you're there? So Old Point Comfort was really connected by steam and by rail. You could get there from anywhere, or from there to anywhere. One interesting route, if you look at this, if you look at this image here, this is an ad from the Old Dominion Steamship Company. And they were a daily steamship line that went directly from, I don't know if you can see it from there, from New York City to Old Point Comfort every day. Imagine what a destination you have to be to get a direct to New York City to your resort. And then this one here, this is an advertisement from the Chamberlain, and they're obviously just showing how easy it is to get there. Look at all the water routes, and you can see the rail line coming down the peninsula, and of course some routes from the south. There's even a rail line coming down here from the eastern shore. You can just take a quick ferry right across. So let's take a look. Here's again a little more detail about the Old Dominion line. Check out their advertisement featuring Fort Monroe's main gate. It's the place to go. And the interesting thing, well, the way you would ride this line was overnight. You would get on the ship at 3 p.m. in New York City. Your ticket was $17, and you would arrive at Old Point Comfort at 9 in the morning. And you can see the grid here. It tells you what you'd see, I guess they're not landmarks, but the things that you'd see to know and pace your progress. So you see things like, no, they would be landmarks. So different lighthouses, lightships, going from New York to Sandy Hook, Chincoteague, and all these things we can kind of picture as we take ourselves down the eastern seaboard. Just for a frame of reference, $17, it's tricky to calculate what things were worth in the past, but the average salary in 1901 was about $438. A bicycle cost $16.75, and a dozen eggs is 23 cents. So think about that in terms of a ticket price. If you use like an inflation calculator, $17 comes out to about $600 in today's money. So when you think about what would it cost to take a flight somewhere, could correlate. So you see the picture of the steamer there. That particular one, that's the Monroe. It had 150 in first class, which would have sleeping quarters, as well as 78 in steerage, 53 for deck passengers, which would be more like a chair situation, 82 crew. And when you think about supply and demand, things that they did just made economic sense. They also had hammocks on the deck for Navy Yard workers to get between the Navy Yards here and in New York. So they had a little collateral space for those workers. So just to give you a sense, there was a ton of steamship lines. This one, Merchants and Miners, went from Boston and Providence to Old Point Comfort. Of course, you have the Norfolk and Washington, lots of steamers coming from Washington because, of course, Washington was also a big railroad hub. So take the railroad to Washington, then steam on down to Old Point, as well as Baltimore was a big destination and connection as well. So you could also get to Point Comfort by rail. And I wish this was still here, lovely little rail depot, right near where the marina is today. And if you ever go to Fort Monroe, there's this little white post sticking up kind of near where the marina, the Dead Rise restaurant is. It says milepost 0. And that's exactly what it was. It was the end of the line for the C&O Railroad. The fact that the railroad came to Fort Monroe was the brainwave of Harrison Phoebus. And you probably recognize that name Phoebus for the little town that's just outside of Fort Monroe. He worked his way up he was a Union veteran of the Civil War. He worked his way up in the Adams Express Company. The Daily Press reporter, Park Rouse, he called Phoebus a one-man industry. He was Old Point's postmaster, notary public, U.S. commissioner, insurance agent, and representative of shipping companies. Pretty busy guy. He also, in 1876, took a major interest, over 50% interest in the Second Hygeia. And he made it his business to make it compete with any hotel in the country. And he learns that a guy named Collis Huntington is bringing the railroad down the peninsula from Richmond to help get his coal to port. And Phoebus talks Huntington into bringing a rail spur over to Point Comfort, not only to supply the fort, but also to bring passengers to his hotel. If you were to take the train from DC to Point Comfort, it would take you about 5.5 hours. That's faster than it is sometimes with traffic. And you would depart around 11 a.m. and get there around 4:30. One other transportation, if you'll humor me here, this, if you're starting to think about how would I get to Point Comfort, this is the way I would take. This was actually the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk Railroad, NYPNN, and this was also the efforts of a coal magnate from Erie, Pennsylvania. He was looking for a way, just like we do nowadays, to get around the DC corridor, and so he used the Eastern Shore. It was also called the Cape Charles route, and you would take this rail route had a night train and a day train, twice a day, 5 days a week, and you'd come down Cape Charles, and then you have a little ferry that took you over to Point Comfort and then on to Norfolk. So that route would take about 11 to 12 hours, including the ferry ride. So I think that would be a nice scenic route. So starting to get a sense, hopefully, of how you can get to Point Comfort. There's lots of ways, lots of routes. Let's start thinking about where you'll stay. And on our map and the timeline, we saw those 3 major hotels. Let's take a closer look at those. So the oldest of those 3 that are standing on the point in this period is the Hygeia, the second Hygeia. The first one was actually torn down during the Civil War. The tourists were a nuisance to the soldiers there, and plus the hotel got in the way of the fort's guns. So the Hygeia is built shortly after the Civil War, and it expands and expands and expands, and especially under that 1876 to 1886 period with Harrison Phoebus, really, really grows. It's a 3-story building in the style of the Second Empire with open verandas on all levels. It could accommodate 1,000 guests, and here's a quote from Harrison Phoebus highlighting his hotel. He says, "The modest building, which had at first offered ample accommodations, required successive enlargements and additions, until at the present time a mammoth edifice fronts the bay, covering over 2 acres, requiring nearly 5 acres of carpets, with more than 90 miles of steam, water, drain, ventilating, and gas pipes, and over 19 acres of painted surface, fitted with every luxury which modern ingenuity has devised to add to the comfort of hotel life." So quite grand. And take a notice of this pose that they have here. I think I've seen about at least 3 or 4 with sort of a similar pose. So here we have three boys. And do you notice the difference between the hotel here and here? And take a look at the quote there. "A summer resort or cold weather sanitarium has during the cold weather over 15,000 square feet of spacious verandas encased in glass, enabling the most delicate invalid to enjoy the sunshine and fine water without the slightest exposure." A year-round resort. Makes sense to market yourself that way, right? Especially when you have the accommodating and salubrious climate of Old Point Comfort. So what does the Hygeia have to offer? Ballroom, game room, seaside dining. Love this quote up here, noting the canvasback duck, which, feeding upon a vegetation peculiar to the neighborhood, gives them exquisite flavor. So the ducks have some good eats as well. Here's where we begin to hear from Grace Bickford. She's writing to her sister Ina, and she says, "I wonder if you would care to know what I had for dinner tonight. Would you like to know? I will try to remember so I can tell you. My waiter's name is Robert, and he is just as nice as he can be. First course, raw oysters, crackers, and mixed sweet pickle. Second course, apple fritters, green goose, sweet corn, mashed potatoes, and spinach. Third course, coconut custard pie, chocolate ice cream, ladyfingers, and mixed cakes, figs, and a small cup of coffee, or as we call it, a small coffee. It sounds like a good deal when it is told over, but I really ate a very light dinner, for I only tasted several of the articles and did not even taste the spinach. The potatoes and coffee were the only dishes I cleared. I have a very good living down here, for I eat in the main hall. Sounds pretty good, right? The Hygeia, the second Hygeia, was actually razed. And I've seen two accounts of what happened to it. One is that the army ordered it torn down and that they were planning to build something on that site. The thing they were planning to build never materialized. It was ceded over and became Continental Park. I've also seen things that said that the owners of the Chamberlain bought the Hygeia and kind of tipped towards its demise. So maybe a combination of both of those things. Let's take a look at the Chamberlain. The Chamberlain is newer. It is 754 feet long. It's the first resort entirely illuminated by electric lights. First resort in the country. It's 6 stories. It has 554 rooms and can accommodate 1,000 guests. While Grace is there, she makes 2 friends. One is Miss Barnett, who is like a young mother from a well-to-do family. She's there with her 2 children and her maid, and her husband's away. They're kind of enjoying the spring. And she also meets a lady named Mrs. Maloof, who's older, and she's very determined, as Grace puts it, on keeping her an old maid. So you'll hear these names, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of context. But in Grace, in talking about Mrs. Barnett and Mrs. Maloof, we learn a little bit about the Chamberlain. She writes, "Last evening, Mrs. Barnett wanted me to come in and take a salt sea bath in her bathtub. I was only too glad to accept, and I enjoyed the bath immensely. It is so invigorating. There is both hot and cold seawater and hot and cold fresh water in all the bathtubs. Mrs. Maloof says I may use her bathroom anytime I like, so if I don't take sea baths, it won't be because I don't get the chance." And it's really gratifying in a way to hear Grace talk about the hot and cold fresh and the hot and cold seawater, and then you see it in the hotel advertisements as advertised. So interesting to hear that. And take a look at this postcard image here. What do you think they're trying to show off in this postcard? The electricity, right. I mean, just look, it's glowing. And note Grace's comment. She says, 6 o'clock and the sunset gun has just been fired and the electric lights turned on. I mean, just imagine that day and age. That was an event, the lights turning on. We take it so for granted today, but that was the case. Grace gives us a little description of Miss Barnett, too, which I'll share with you because I think it kind of helps us understand what type of guests were staying at the Chamberlain. You will wonder who Mrs. Barnett is. She is the wife of A.W. Barnett of Philadelphia, who is engaged in the manufacture of files. They must be paying about $200 a week for the privileges of the hotel. They have 2 sleeping rooms, a bathroom, and a private dining room, and only Mrs. Barnett, the 2 children, and a maid are here. She's full of fun, and not knowing anyone here and being very lonely, she came to me for comfort and consolation, and yesterday was good enough to devote to me, taking me about to see these places of interest. Using our handy inflation calculator, $200 would be about $5,900 today, or $860 a night. So Not a perfect apples to apples, but gives you an idea. Now, what does the Chamberlain have to offer? See a postcard here. Dining, dancing, and hopefully you can make out that center image. They had a 50-foot water slide in their pool, which was indoor, and little description of the pool is worth reading. The swimming pool is for those who bathe for pleasure as well as those who seek the well-known medicinal properties of seawater bathing. This magnificent swimming pool is furnished in ceramic mosaic tile, and the water surface, 40 by 70 feet, is radiant with sunlight from the enormous skylight above, which covers almost the entire pool. All the delight and benefit of an ocean swim are provided indoors, for the pool is filled with filtered seawater, constantly pouring in from the bay that fronts the hotel. Of course, in cold weather, this is heated to the proper temperature, while the aerial water slide, pitched 50 feet in the air, provides a stunt sufficiently exciting for the exhilarating for the expert and the daring. Footnote to that, there's also daily exhibitions in life-saving, expert swimming, and fancy diving, in case you wanted to check out any of those displays. The Chamberlain, the first Chamberlain, lovely wooden building, burned down in 1920. And when you think about just the grandness of this hotel, and it was a total loss. No lives were lost, but wow, what a treasure and jewel that was, and great expense that was lost then. So I would say that the Hygeia and the Chamberlain are the fanciest of the hotels, but you also had another very good option, which was the Sherwood Inn. The Sherwood Inn was within 2 minutes walk of the steamship wharves. The electric trains stop at the door, and the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad station is within a block of the hotel. Very accessible, and if you check out your map, it's right by the water. It is indeed right by all those transportation hubs, and very, very convenient. And it's not bad to look at either. You remember the quote about, I know of no other place more exempt from bilious diseases. Well, the person who said that was Dr. Robert Archer, and the Sherwood Inn started out as his house. And he was the post physician. Eventually was sold, enlarged, and became the Sherwood Inn. Sherwood could hold about 300 guests at highest capacity. And let's see here. Here's some interior views. Here they're boasting their excellent cuisine. It's also well known that the soldiers at the fort would often take their meals at the hotels. For whatever reason, the Army had worked out this deal where the soldiers could take meals there. And the Sherwood Inn had the nickname among the soldiers as the Shy of Food Inn. Apparently, they didn't think that the cuisine was as excellent as advertised. We've thought a little bit about how you get to Point Comfort, where you could stay once you arrive, but what will you do when you're there? And one of the big things that the hotels advertise and boast of is the health and recreation. Especially the health. It was a big thing that, considered very healthy, doctors would often recommend sunshine, salt water, and sea air. And the Chamberlain and Hygeia made it their business to have these wonderful open verandas, and you can see folks sitting out there observing the bay. Grace says, "The air is delicious. It is warm and balmy, but not too warm for people to wear their furs, even down here. But they wrap themselves and sit outdoors where they can watch the waves and the boats." You'll notice, too, that the quote here says, "In the pavilion, one may bask in the sun for the entire day and breathe the ozone-laden air." That was a big thing. Another source states, "The winds are abundantly laden with ozone, which the ocean breezes always contain a superabundance." Lots of ozone, very good for you. So in addition to just the general therapies of swimming in the saltwater pool, taking the saltwater baths, breathing in the ozone-laden air, the hotels both offered special baths. And these baths required a prescription. This was, as a remedial agency, fast supplanting medicine, if you can believe it. And you'll see this kind of wordy piece here. This is the frontispiece of a little booklet with the title, Bathing for Health and Pleasure, a little talk about baths in general and those at the Chamberlain in particular. So this little booklet that tells you about all the treatments listed here, electric, hydrotherapeutic, and light baths that you can take with under the doctor's prescription. And prepare yourself for this next slide. So here's some of the hydro, light, and electrotherapeutic bath options that you can have at the Hotel Chamberlain. You'll notice the picture on the left is the douche room. And when I turned the page to this picture, I just burst out laughing because it just looks like a soda jerk or something, seltzer bottle gag or something. But you would pay to get this treatment. And what they said was, by changing the temperature and the pressure of the water, it created different thermal and mechanical irritations from the mildest to the most destructive. And these variations, these mechanical and thermal irritations, would serve to help the absorption of abnormal deposits and help remove congestions of the deep-seated organs. So pretty fascinating. The second picture you see there is the application of Finsen rays. Finsen rays, F-I-N-S-E-N. Apparently it's the guy who invented it. And the vibrations of blue, red, orange, and ultraviolet rays possess a great germicidal power. They also had something called light baths, which these were, they noted that these are featured by Edward VII, favored by Edward VII and installed in Buckingham Palace. And remember our hotel visitors sitting out on the veranda enjoying the sun? Well, what if your doctor said you need a month of that, but you only have a couple days, you only have a week? Well, don't worry, these light baths will actually use parabolic mirrors to concentrate the sun rays and provide an efficient and controllable substitute for sunshine, a means of concentrating the net value of months of rest into a few days or weeks of treatment. So you can just smush all that sunshine into this light bath and you'll be good to go. Visitors were also very pleased that the Chamberlain had, at least according to the Chamberlain, that they had installed a new cabinet system which ensured that guests were no longer be obliged to enter a room filled with the exhalations from the bodies of other persons. It's a relief, because nobody wants that. These baths, I'll just give you a list of the maladies that they purported to, baths and treatments that they purported to alleviate. Sciatica, lumbago, Bright's disease, diabetes, that national stomachache dyspepsia, neurasthenia, gout, rheumatism, debility, insomnia, chronic inflammation, neuralgia and general nervousness, chronic diseases of the kidney, liver, and bladder, and diseases of the heart and blood vessels. So you don't want to turn these down. I know what you're probably thinking, though. Wouldn't it be a pain to go down to the baths and get these treatments? You'll have to leave your room. Don't worry. There is the bath perambulator. And it's kind of long, but I think it's worth just reading this whole thing because it's fascinating. Another feature which marks the establishment at the Chamberlain is that anyone may be taken from his apartments directly to the baths without the trouble and annoyance of having to dress for this purpose. Enclosed wheelchairs are provided, as well as a special elevator. Thus, one may have a chair brought to one's apartments and, entering it, be wheeled to the especially provided elevator, used for no other purpose, and conveyed directly to the bath establishment. At the completion of his bath, can be taken back to his rooms without having had the annoyance of dressing or disrobing at all. To those who have experienced the annoyance and trouble of having to arrange a toilet once or twice for the purpose of taking a bath, this is a convenience which cannot fail appreciation. The bath perambulator. So in addition to these healthy amenities that you can take advantage of, doctors were also frequently prescribing recreation and sport, and there was no lack of these at the Chamberlain. You'll note from the advertisements here, tennis, bathing, fishing. I don't know if you can see on the map here, but the Chamberlain actually had a 10,000-acre hunting preserve right up here, be in the area about Charles City, James City counties, about an hour from the Chamberlain. And here's one of the things that they say about their hunting preserve. All strictly preserved under the charge of a gamekeeper and his staff, men who know how. You will not even need, you gunners, to bring your dogs. The Hotel Chamberlain will provide them. Quite an offering. The Hotel Chamberlain actually at first used Hampton's golf course, but then built their own, which now still operating today as the Woodlands. And you see we have our lady golfer here, arm in arm with both arms of the service at Fort Monroe. And that kind of brings us to the next amenity that we'll talk about. The hotels really pumped up the fact that they were on an army post. And the guest can, if he wishes, rise at reveille and retire at taps. I don't know if you can make out this image here, but it says, a fair charge. And you have a lady sitting on the cannon here. Of course, guests down here watching the dress parade on the parade field. And Grace writes to her sister, I was wishing as I passed the fort today that you and Annie might be here to see the cannon large and small and the balls. And right by those things I saw 2 or 3 rabbits nibbling away on the grass. It was quite a picture, like peace and war united. Now, as you look back on the resort history of Fort Monroe, it's kind of funny coexistence of a fort and resort together at the same place. And there are a lot of accounts of commanding officers at the fort complaining about the distraction that this is, things like soldiers moonlighting as bouncers and things like this. But visitors are very much an audience for the military as they're doing their thing. The military band got a lot of attention. Grace talks about them saying, I did not wonder that the men were willing to rush into battle or anywhere else with that music. It was grand. The American Resorts magazine said, the military band from Fort Monroe would awaken the rhythmic instincts in the feet of a mummy. I mean, isn't that just a great scene? It looks like New Orleans or something. You got the marching band in the street, you got the cable car in the background, and let's see, I'll go too fast there. But yeah, right there, there's the Chamberlain, the steamship wharf going off behind them. So quite a picture. The other thing that you could do at the fort was excursions. There was a lot right within striking distance. For instance, thinking about Grace and her father being a minister, she often talks about going to service at St. John's Church, the old St. John's, which is still there in downtown Hampton. And the brochures talk about visiting the Soldiers' Home and visiting the Hampton and Normal and Agricultural Institute. The Soldiers' Home now being the VA hospital, and Hampton Normal School being Hampton University. Grace gives an interesting account of visiting Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. She says, About 3 o'clock, Mrs. Barnett and I started for Hampton again, this time to visit the Institute for African and Indian Students. At 3:30, all the boys formed in companies. The band played. They marched and countermarched until they formed a double line diagonally across the campus, and then were inspected. After inspection, they marched into the chapel building, everyone passing under the flags at the door. It was a fine sight to see those Indian and Negro boys and girls in the chapel. I really could not form any idea of the number. I wish you could have heard the singing. There was no organ or piano or other instrument to lead, but there were over 30 voices in the chorus, and the music was grand. Oh, I enjoyed it so much. 6 girls and 2 boys were baptized and joined the church. So this is the type of thing that hotel visitors would do. They would go witness these activities going on in Hampton. Now, one other excursion, save this for last for you guys, is that you could go to Norfolk. For a touch of the city life, with its shops and theaters, Norfolk, one of the most flourishing of the Atlantic seaboard cities, is within an hour's run by ferry with boats every hour. Now, for this part, I'd like you to take a look. I had a handout of a full transcript of one of Grace's letters. And I'd like to read the part to you about when she visits Norfolk. And when I listen to this in my mind, I like to picture her route. Oh, what if there was a ferry still today? And that went from Old Point to Ocean View. And let's hear what she says. After service, Mrs. B and I hustled home and got our lunch. And at 2 o'clock, we started for Norfolk. Our soldier boy, Mr. Jolliffe, took that trip with us. We went across the channel on the ferry boat and then took the trolley to Norfolk. We first took a ride through the residential part of the city, then walked past the city hall and to the ferry for Portsmouth. There we tried to get into the Navy Yard, but they did not allow visitors on Sunday, so we went back home. To Norfolk, then home. The ride across the channel on the Ocean View was delightful. It takes about 20 minutes. It was just after sundown, and the stars, how is it? Silently, one by one, in the infinite meadows of heaven, blossomed the lovely stars, the forget-me-nots of the angels. I also counted 4 or 5 lighthouses and buoys along the channel. I stood outside and watched it alone for a while. Then I thought how selfish I was and went back into the cabin and got Mrs. B and Mr. Jolliffe. We reached the Hygeia about 7 o'clock, tired but happy. We did have such a jolly time. Of course, Mrs. B and I had our furs on, and I wish you could have seen the people look at us. It would not have attracted any more if Mr. J had worn his uniform, but we seemed to be the cynosure of all eyes. I had dinner as I did lunch with Mrs. Barnett in her dining room, and Mr. Jolliffe came over and spent a few hours with us in the parlor. On the whole, it was a delightful day for me. It seems like getting out of prison every time I get out of this hotel. So I hope that you can imagine this heyday of the Old Point Comfort Resort a little better than you could when we started this evening. I think it's powerful, touching that the same things that tourists were coming to visit at Fort Monroe are still there today. The salubrious climate and sea air, all the wonderful history is still there. So maybe this too will spark in you a little, give you a little spark to come visit Fort Monroe and stop by and see us at the Casemate Museum. I would just say this is a quote from Harrison Phoebus, and it's a good one to end with. When evening falls around you once again, if you be at all romantically inclined and can secure a fitting companion, let me whisper in your ear that there are few places more adapted for a romantic moonlight stroll than the turf-covered ramparts of Fortress Monroe. With that, the present writer leaves you to your own devices and bids you lovingly adieu.